So I now call on our Chair of the Day, Peter Davis, to take over the meeting and further introduce our guest speaker. Peter.
Thank you, President Phillip. Charlie Thomas is a respected leader in Australian agriculture and public policy. Raised on a farm near Condobolin, New South Wales, Charlie's early experience shaped his deep commitment to advancing the interests of rural communities and Australia's farm sector. Over more than 15 years, Charlie has honed his strategic and collaborative approach to political advocacy. He has earned a reputation for enhancing the impact of member-based organisations through strategic partnerships, successful advocacy, and deep engagement with stakeholders. Before joining the Victorian Farmers Federation, Charlie held senior positions in policy and corporate affairs at the National Farmers Federation, Property Council of Australia, and NSW Farms Association. At the National Farmers Federation, Charlie led the organisation's advocacy strategy, focusing on sustainability, land use, and regularity reform. Charlie holds legal qualifications from the University of Sydney and a Master of Business Administration from Melbourne Business School. Please welcome Charlie.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you to the club for having me here today to spend some time evangelising about Victorian agriculture, which is something I like to do at any opportunity. And I would say, just getting the vibe in the room, it does feel a bit, if I take away the neckties and the salubrious surrounds, it does feel a bit like a VFF branch meeting. And I think that speaks to the shared sort of, the sense of purpose and legacy and community that is part of both of our organisations. And I did just want to acknowledge as well just the phenomenal work that Rotary does in supporting farming communities in times of need, and we have had more times of need in recent times across the farming communities of Victoria than we would like. So no, thank you to Rotary for all that you do. So as mentioned, about 9 months ago, I took over as the CEO of the Victorian Farmers Federation, and I've been on a bit of a journey of discovery about the ag sector here in Victoria, and I wanted to share a bit of that journey with you today, because I think the preconceptions that I came into this role with do mirror a lot of the preconceptions that I think people in Melbourne who are disconnected from the industry have about what farming in Victoria actually is. And the core of that preconception, I would say, is probably a highly romanticised view of the industry. And it is cultivated by the connection between the food scene in Melbourne and you know what you see as farmers on the TV and the reality of farming here in Victoria. And it's probably informed for me by being from New South Wales originally, not being a Victorian. And when you're in New South Wales and you think, where are the agricultural powerhouses of Australia? You tend to look north and you think about the wide open plains of Queensland or the Northern Territory or WA, where agriculture is an enormous part of those economies. It's part of the way of life. And you assume that that is where the bulk of Australian agricultural activity is happening, but it's not so. And then you look south and you think, you know, you've got really high quality boutique sort of produce coming out of Victoria, and your mind goes to Blackmore Wagyu and Meredith's goat's cheese, fantastic household names and high-end premium products that come out of Victoria. And all of that is true, of course, of the Victorian industry. It has this amazing connection, a two-way sort of feeder system between one of the world's most amazing food cultures here in Melbourne and one of the world's most amazing agricultural industries on its doorstep. And one feeds the other, and they both benefit from that relationship. But what I didn't appreciate was the scale of what's happening in Victoria, because all of that sounds very niche, very boutique. But when you look at the raw numbers, and I want to throw some numbers at you now just to give you a sense of the scale of what's happening here. So Victoria, it is a small state geographically. We have about 3% of Australia's agricultural land, but we actually produce about a quarter of Australia's agricultural production off just 3% of Australia's ag land. So we're 8 times as productive as the next state. Absolutely incredible. We produce about $20 billion worth of product that gets exported to 172 countries all around the world. And we're highly diversified. So we're the only state in Australia that has 5 different commodity sectors in agriculture that produce more than $2 billion worth of product every year. And what that means is we've got this tremendous variety of high quality ingredients that then feed a really vibrant food manufacturing sector. So Victoria is home to 1 in every 2 food manufacturing jobs that exist in Australia. It is by far and away the largest manufacturing sector that exists in Victoria. And we're also the smart ag capital, because we produce more than half of the agriculture graduates that come out of universities and tertiary education institutions within all of Australia. So it creates this really unique ecosystem of really high value adding, high intensity production, very valuable production, highly productive land, and the academic smarts to kind of back that up and sustain it. And it has reminded me of another example that we in agricultural policy circles always point to as the gold standard for how you have a thriving agricultural economy in a developed nation. And that's a tiny nation with only 1.8 million hectares of agricultural land. Victoria has something like 11 million, but it's the second largest ag exporter in the world, and that's the Netherlands. And so what the Netherlands has done is combine really clever research smarts, world-class logistics with ports like Rotterdam on the doorstep of Europe, where they basically play the role of feeding that entire trading bloc. They've got incredible value-adding work that goes on within that ecosystem. And so we sort of look at that gold standard and we now look at ourselves and we think, hey, Victoria's sort of heading in that same direction. We are the value-adding capital. We've got the smarts. We've got, amazing freight infrastructure here in Victoria, like the Port of Melbourne. We're on the doorstep of Asia with that same sort of potential that the Netherlands taps into, being on the doorstep of Europe or part of Europe. So we are, in many ways in Victoria, we're following that Dutch example. And that's really exciting for us to think about then how much further we can push that envelope into the future. And the opportunities are absolutely immense, because the fundamentals of this industry are incredible. You've got, a growing population, 10 billion mouths to feed globally by 2050. Many of those choosier, hungrier, richer customers are on our doorstep in Asia. So we do look at everything that we're doing here with enormous optimism, and really want to look at how we sort of push the boundaries. But that's all to set the context of why what I'm going to continue to talk about today matters. But what I want to turn to now are some of the challenges that we're facing in Victoria. And there are more than this, but I'm going to focus on 3. Firstly, the productivity story. Now, productivity isn't a very exciting topic, a fairly dry economic topic, but it is probably the most important thing happening in our industry at the moment, is a stagnating growth rate in productivity. And the reason this matters is because if you look at what's happening with our prices that we get for our products. So take a ton of wheat. In 2005, if you were to sell a ton of wheat, you would have got about $200 for it. With CPI, in real terms, today that'd be worth about $340. The actual price at Farmgate at the moment is closer to $300. So we are not keeping up with CPI in terms of the rate, the money that we're getting for our product. On the flip side, our input prices are skyrocketing. So fuel, fertilizer, labour, land, water, machinery, doesn't matter what you look at, they are going up far faster than CPI. And you look at that economics and you say, well, how does that work? How have farmers stayed in business? And the answer is productivity. Because over the last 50 years or so, we have undergone the most incredible transformation in our industry. From what was known as the Green Revolution through to the Gene Revolution, we've hit productivity growth rates of about 2.5% in our industry between the sort of 50s and the 80s and 90s. But that's now stopped. So those incredible advances in gene technology, in new plant varieties, in new cropping techniques have really, we are now working at the margins. And it is the sort of story of, you can only move from a horse to a car once, and then you're just tinkering around about how to make a better car. And we do think that on the horizon, there are new breakthrough technologies available, but we have spent the last 20 years tinkering around the edges of existing technology. And the impacts of that are really starting to be felt on family farming businesses. That cost price squeeze is real, and it is creating a situation where we really need to think about what that looks like in the future. And the way that farmers are surviving now is through aggregation and expansion. That's achieving greater economies of scale, which means more debt, buying out the neighbours, which has implications for local communities as well. The second thing I wanted to point to was land use. So as I've already said, 3% of Australia's agricultural land producing a quarter of Australia's agricultural production. incredibly productive land that we have here in Victoria, which is a national treasure, particularly as we look forward to a larger population in Australia, a climate uncertain future. So we need to be thinking about how we protect this strategically for the future. But it is under pressure like never before. So whether it's housing encroachment, whether it's using land for energy development, whether it's using land increasingly for carbon projects, whether it's mining moving into agricultural land in Victoria where it's never taken place before, there is an enormous array of projects that are getting proposed for what is currently prime agricultural land, all of which have value. We're not here to say we shouldn't be doing renewable energy, we shouldn't be doing housing. Of course we should. But it's how we do that in a strategic way. And at the moment, here in Victoria, our planning system doesn't actually have the capacity to take agricultural impacts into account in the way that it needs to. It doesn't think about cumulative impacts in the way that these projects add up in certain agricultural regions, how those impacts flow through the supply chain into our food manufacturing and the inputs that those businesses need from farms in order to keep sustainable. So we are really trying to drive a conversation with the state government here about how do we do this better? How do we do it smarter? Victoria is falling behind other states in how we're managing these issues. And we're home to some of the world's best and certainly Australia's best agricultural land. So we need to do better. The last and probably the most topical at the moment is just our input security. And as a sector at the moment, we are having an enormous we told you so moment, which if it wasn't so expensive, we'd probably feel really happy about. Because for years now, our sector has been crying out and trying to raise attention about the issue of Australia's dependence on critical inputs from overseas, particularly for agriculture. So we all know a lot about what's happening with the fuel situation at the moment. Obviously, Australia is almost entirely dependent on imported fuels and oils. But fertiliser, now people in this room probably know more about that than they did only a couple of months ago, but 60% of the fertiliser that comes into Australia comes via the Strait of Hormuz, now no longer flowing. But there's other things that we haven't drawn as much attention to. So if you think about the crop protection products that we use, so pesticides, herbicides, which are responsible for about 60% of the production in Australia, you take those away, production decreases by more than half. 95% of the active ingredients that goes into those products comes from just two countries, China and India. China alone is about 80%. And so that is an enormous dependency that we have. And you go further through the supply chain, there's other things, the CO2 gases, your AdBlue for all of the machinery itself, it all comes in on a boat. And we need to be having a clever conversation about what we want the settings to be in the future in order to make sure that we can continue to feed ourselves and continue the contribution we make to feeding the world in a more uncertain global environment. So these are three huge conversations that need to take place. How do we keep family farms sustainable in the midst of changing economics in a country where we do not subsidise our farmers? And we are very proud of that fact. We do not want to be subsidised, but the reality is that most other advanced economies do. How do we make sure that we've got the farmland, our most basic input for the work that we do, protected into the future, particularly in a place like Victoria, where it is incredibly precious, particularly for Australia in a changing climate? And how do we make sure that we have the security in our supply chains to know that we can continue to produce as global environments change? So they're the three conversations that we as an organisation are really trying to drive, particularly this year in the lead up to a state election, and shamelessly capitalising on some of the crises that we have unfolding at the moment. And for us as an organisation, we are focused on how do we turn those challenges into opportunities. So there are solutions available to all of these problems. And that's really exciting. For us, this is our moment. This is our opportunity to be having these conversations. But we need to bring the community along with us. And if I look back to what differentiates us from the Netherlands, every child growing up in the Netherlands understands and is proud of the fact that their little tiny country, their little postage stamp, plays a critical role in feeding that entire continent. Here in Australia, we don't have the same culture. We don't understand the value of what we have here in Victoria in terms of agricultural assets and the critical role that plays in feeding not only the rest of Australia, but the rest of our region. So we need to change that conversation. We need to continue to drive the innovation that will lift productivity. We need foundations for sustainable land use, and we need to use this crisis to strengthen our supply chains for the future. If we do this right, the opportunity is absolutely immense. As I said before, 10 billion people on the planet. We've got an immense opportunity to tap into that, being a trusted trading partner, a really high value, high quality exporter to our region. And what we've achieved so far in Victoria has probably come about a lot by luck. We didn't turn into the Dutch down under by having a really clear strategy for what we wanted to achieve in food manufacturing, how we wanted to support the industry into the future. It's just kind of happened by luck and, sheer effort. But it probably won't get us much further than this. We do need governments who are concentrating on how do we maximise the potential of this industry as a really sustainable long-term earner for the Victorian economy. And so that's the challenge before us. The opportunities are there, and we just need to keep government focused on that. I might pull it up there because I think I've probably come close to my time, but happy to take some questions.
Thanks, Charlie. Charlie's agreed to take some questions, and I'm sure that a lot of people out there have got some good questions for Charlie. So, yeah, the microphone's going to come around. Please stand up and give us your name before asking your question. Thank you.
While I sorting that out, I'll ask a question, Charlie.
Phil Enders.
Yes, only the last few months, to think about. One of the things that I find is that when we talk about they do look after their own when it comes to farming. I do know one of our who was involved in the tomato side of things that the was coming out of Italy were selling in Australia for less than what they thought.
Yeah.
Is it about time? You made a comment about tariffs or some protection. Is it about time now to look after our own and the farmers have some form of protection?
It's a conversation we now need to have. We, as an industry, so the farm sector in Australia really drove a lot of the trade liberalisation that happened through the 70s. We were the first people to put our hands up and say, do you know what? We think we can compete on an equal footing, toe-to-toe with anyone on the planet because we are so efficient, like radically more efficient than any other farming sector in the world because we don't have those subsidies. We've had to learn how to do it. And we wanted to lead by example for a couple of generations now. On the world stage, Australian agriculture and the Australian government in partnership has tried to bring other nations with us and say, get rid of the subsidies. They are economically damaging. They are ultimately not helping reduce the cost of food for your own populations. Get rid of the trade distortions, get rid of the tariffs. And we've had success on that, but not complete success. And now we are doing this massive reversal. So countries are upping their subsidies to farmers. They are radically upping their tariffs in response to the Trump agenda. And we're getting swept away in that tide. And it's probably at a stage now where we can't fight that tide anymore. We probably need to be thinking about, if you can't beat them, join them to some degree, while still trying to provide that leadership for a better option. Yeah.
Well, actually, myself. And Charlie, we're smart, technologically advanced. What are the options about leading the climate lead society in relation to youth?
And I mentioned where I said we've spent the last 20 years tinkering with building a better car. We look at AI and in particular quantum computing as the opportunities for those next big leaps forward in what we're doing. We work in really complex systems, and the fundamental science that underpins our understanding of those, our understanding of physics, chemistry, these sort of fields haven't radically changed in the last 30 or so years. But with these new technologies, maybe that's where we can complete that understanding and, understand in more detail how to do faster gene editing and all of these sorts of things that can unlock massive jumps in our productivity. And AI is already being used. So we do use in a lot of our automated, what we call variable rate applications. So we use drone and other remote sensing imagery to understand field conditions. We then go out and apply fertilizers and other chemicals based on the needs at a very, very micro level. And that's all based on artificial intelligence. We've got cameras on spray rigs now that can detect what we call green on green technology. So you can differentiate weeds from other plant species in the, crop species. So you've got those targets for chemical application. It is bringing us a long way forward, but it's, like I said, it's just not quite moving as fast as we needed to keep pace with the cost of inputs.
Okay.
Yep.
Karen Johnson. I have a question for you, Charlie, about food security. Really very important to me, and especially I come out of the oil industry, so I'm really amazed, what's going on at the moment. But the issue for me was going back a few years when we had the price wars with milk and the dairy farmers. And I learned that dairy farmers were having such a hard time because some of those farmers were selling up their farms, but they were selling them to offshore enterprises.
Yep.
Now I'm really concerned that it doesn't appear to me that our government has a lot of control about who comes in and provides some of our resources. And this recent issue about energy supply has really highlighted the issue about security and independence, not relying on globalisation to the extent that we did. But particularly food security is the number one issue. What are your comments about that, please?
Well, my first comment is I'm very glad food security is your number one issue because it should be everyone's. With the foreign investment, it's a double-edged sword. So we as a country, we do export about 70% of what we produce. Not in every product category and not in some of the ones that are most sensitive for food security, like fresh fruit and veg, dairy. But we also are desperate for capital. So to fund the industry's growth ambitions, we know using technology and intensification, following that sort of Dutch example, putting more produce under glass in greenhouses, those sorts of things can radically improve our productivity. But it takes a lot of money, and the money isn't in Australia to do that. So to the extent that foreign investment brings in capital to enable us to grow the industry and grow the pie, then we should welcome that. But if it's coming in and not adding value, if it's just coming in and displacing family farmers and gutting communities, which it does do in some instances, that's bad, obviously. So we need a nuanced approach, which we absolutely don't have at the moment, which somehow incentivizes in the same way that our visa system tries to work. We don't, we bring in the skills and the types of people that we think will add value to the economy. We should be doing the same with investors into industries like agriculture.
Somewhere in, I think it's northwestern Victoria, that farmer is going to be faced with the potential of $80 fine for not permitting the transmission line people onto his property, and if he stops again, it's $80,000 a year.
Yep.
That's one farmer, and there's a whole lot of farmers in the same boat. What's the BFF's position relative to this? What is emerging? There's a really big battle with these transmission lines. Yeah,
no, thanks, Bob. It's a critical issue, and it's just to be really clear about our position up front. We don't think that access should be happening in a compulsory way at this stage, because the company that is doing that particular project, and it's the same for many projects across the state, they haven't invested the time in actually trying to work with that community and get their consent in a commercial way. So what is happening there is horrific. And we've been very clear with the energy minister and everyone involved in that project that they need to go back to the drawing board, and they need to start again with the community, explaining the rationale for the project, bringing them on the journey and treating them like adults rather than just trying to steamroll in. And this is the same on a whole host of projects at the moment. And so we're trying to reset the entire relationship, and there'll be some stuff in the newspapers later this week about our views on this, but we are calling on the government to just pretty much tear up and start again the rule book on how they're approaching these things, because it's whether it's mining, energy, even housing in some places, we're operating under gold rush rules where the farmland is basically treated as vacant space, just waiting to be developed. It's not actually valued for its inherent purpose. And so that's what we're trying to do, get them to understand and appreciate and put into the planning system something that actually takes into account the role that land is there for.
Question. The government will listen to your request for more discussion, go back to the drawing board. That doesn't seem to be the way in which they're operating.
At this stage, no indication that they have any interest of doing that, if I'm honest with you. That line in particular, people will debate its merit and its value to the broader economy, but it is the government's very clear view is that must get built to keep the lights on in Victoria. Now, there's plenty of academics and others who would disagree with that and think that there are other ways of approaching this, but they're single-minded about it at the moment, but we can only keep making that case.
Charlie. Thanks, Charlie. I've got Charlie very topical at the moment, but I'm wondering What are the choices that farmers have and what their options are with the situation of fuel insecurity, both a doubling in the price of diesel, I think pretty close to, from what I've seen just in the last couple of months, and also just we've got real supply dangers now, and there must be some risks that a lot of farmers are facing in terms of how much do I invest in paying double the price for fuel to just see that I'm unable to harvest or I'm unable to. So what do you have a feeling of what's going through the minds and what the options are? Is it possible to grow a crop with no fertiliser? Are a few of them just deciding to put their boots up? Have you got some thoughts on that?
I certainly do, because just before walking across the road, we compiled the results from our pulse survey that we've had out with members just from the last 72 hours and on this issue. What they're telling us is for the average farm at current prices, the cost impact will be about $315,000 a year this year for the increased cost of fuel and fertiliser. About 2/3 of those farms have already decided to change their business decisions for the coming year. So that means, let's see if we can get one. That means planting less, planting different things. So there are options for particularly cropping farmers to move from nitrogen intensive crops such as canola into less intensive things like lentils, barley, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of that decision making happening. Average yield reduction, most farmers in our survey are saying that 30 to 40% reduction in yield this year. And that's coupled with the increase in costs of, the best part of $500,000. And right now, those decisions are being made because it's about 50% of farmers are still struggling to access fuel that they need. A higher number, closer to 70%, are struggling to access the fertiliser that they need. And when you've got that uncertainty, you're taking a multi-million-dollar gamble planting a crop in this autumn planting window that's starting now and thinking that you're going to have the fuel there to harvest it in December.
Thank you for that, Charlie. I think we're just about out of time. Would everybody join me in thanking Charlie for that very thoughtful and insightful? Before you go, Charlie, just before Charlie.